So to start off this roundtable discussion, Andy, I'd like to have you start off, and you've done a lot of disclosing about Mars, and in great detail, and we had to kind of cut you off there and everything, but I'd like you to address um, what your perspective is on the credibility of Laura's story and of Randy's story, and from your perspective and your experience, what resonates, and just kind of where you're at with all of that.
Well, that's a very good question, and I want to make it perfectly clear that not only do I view Laura and Randy as authentic tellers of their accounts and honest people, but I can share specific facts that are deeply embedded there in their accounts that they could not have made up, that correspond to things that happened to me in both Project Pegasus under DARPA in the early 70s, and then under the CIA's Mars Jump Room program of the early 1980s. In other words, I've just been sort of itching to share some facts that sort of cut through to this issue of credibility and veracity and show that they are authentic whistleblowers and that I affirm their testimony. Of course, in the case of Randy, he's operating under the ambit of military law in being empowered to tell about what happened to him, while the rest of us essentially have been civilian whistleblowers. The first fact that I'd like to share is that shortly after meeting Laura in 2011, when I was curious as to whether she had taken the jump room to Mars, she stated they told me they were calling the conveyance that would take me to Mars an ARC. And then in further interaction with Benny Mendez and Brett Stillings, I recalled the fact that in our training with Major Ed Dames in the summer of 1980, he gave us the technical term for the jump rooms, and it was ARC. And it was an anagram standing for Aeronautical Repositioning Chamber, which is precisely what the space elevator or jump room to Mars was doing. And ARC might have been a double entendre in the sense that one of the reasons the jump room was developed is so that personnel from the U.S. could rapidly go through it to Mars in the event of a planetary catastrophe on Earth, and thereby do their part to save U.S. personnel and the human genome. So ARC may have been a covert reference to the original ARC of Noah in that sense. But that's so highly technical that I think it has high meaning and high value in terms of corroborating Laura's account. The second thing I'd like to add is that she's the great-granddaughter of President Dwight David Eisenhower, whose vice president was Richard Milhous Nixon. Not only were all of the personnel that I interacted with as a child on Project Pegasus Nixon Republicans, from my father to Donald Rumsfeld, but so were the personnel that I interacted with during the CIA's Mars Jump Room days of the early 80s, except I would say that Barry Obama and I were clearly much further to the left and registered Democrats. But I'm just trying to distinguish the point here that the use of quantum access to access past and future times and places on Earth, and also a form of time travel to reach Mars, was a Nixon project. And I have something else to show. I don't know if it's surfaced yet. According to Bernard Mendez, even while at his private residence in San Clemente after leaving the White House, that is resigning on August 9th of 1974, Richard Nixon was serving as an intelligence analyst to the CIA on the Mars Jump Room program. That is to say that while he was still alive, Nixon was a consulting intelligence analyst, and our CVs would have gone across his desk. So there's the Nixon connection again. Nixon was literally participating in the Mars Jump Room program for the CIA. Another deeply embedded fact that relates to Laura, her family background, her immediate story, and the involvement of a family member in the Mars Jump Room program is that we know they were working through families, and they were probably doing so because they wanted to situate a group of American citizens on Mars in the colonies, just as Laura was invited to do. And the family members that we know were involved are indicated right by the immediate group of cadre of whistleblowers who have thus far come forward. I was being trained with my father, and he did one trip, the last trip that I did, which was the May '84 jump, which many of the personnel were on. Brett was on that, Courtney Hunt was on that, and so forth. So then also we have the involvement of the family members Thomas J. Stillings and his son William Brett Stillings. Now, in the case of Laura, her family connection does not just rest in broad terms as being the descendant of a beloved American president. In fact, her aunt, Mary Jean Eisenhower, was one of the jumpers, and Bernard Mendez and I can affirm that in the roughly March 1983 timeframe, we did a night run with both of us together, with Regina Dugan, and a woman that we met. And when she introduced herself as Mary Jean Eisenhower, I asked her whether she was a descendant of Ike, and she stated, "The one and only." Okay, so here we have a connection with the Eisenhower family contributing one of the jumpers, but then also one of the colonists to be approached to settle on Mars. And that's, of course, probably why they were selecting family members or assembling team members who were related. And then the other thing that can't be unwritten, that's deeply embedded, and that shows clearly that Laura is telling the truth, is that, and that her claims correspond with mine, is something that Alfred mentioned, which is that when I was still on Pegasus, as a boy, a year before Laura was born in 1973, she was described in a conversation that took place in front of me as a future political ally of mine. And isn't it curious that of all the 7 billion people in the world, Laura and I are now friends and fellow whistleblowers around the same set of facts? Well, I mean, that's after 30 years, after 40 years since I first heard her name a year before she was born. I mean, that's difficult to unravel. It's so deeply embedded that it literally corroborates her account. Now, Randy went to Mars, and he's made a number of statements. Initially, I was doubtful, but then I've really worked on the non-corresponding information, and I think I can explain it. So let me start with the information that corresponds. In other words, I know I went, so I can now give my testimony that I am absolutely certain that Randy Kramer is authentic and veracious, and he's telling the truth about his experiences on Mars. The first is this. When we were being trained, Dames stated that there were 3 major reasons we were going to be sent to Mars. The first was to establish an extraterrestrial defense regime on the planet Mars, not necessarily against hostile ETs, but simply to protect planet Earth from all threats that could come from outer space. The second was to acquire U.S. territorial sovereignty over Mars by settling individuals there and by sending them there on trips. Well, guess what? Randy was sent there as a permanent settler. He spent 17 years there, and I was sent episodically or periodically about 40 times between 81 and 84. And that our role was described as to acclimate the Martian humanoids and animals to our presence. Well, why would that be necessary? That would be necessary to establish the defense regime. Who is Randy? He's a captain in the U.S. Marine Corps, and it wasn't going to be just some civilian outpost. It was obviously a military operation. And so Randy is literally the embodiment of the military personnel that they described they would be sending after we played our civilian role of going there for immediate practical reasons sounding under public international law, and sort of organic anthropological reasons of letting or of sort of acclimating the Martian humanoids especially, and also the animals, to our presence. Okay, so that's the first thing I find very striking. Then I examine Randy's personal characteristics, and I compare them to the individuals I knew who were the jumpers. He shares the 2 prominent traits of high intelligence and a consummate memory. For example, Randy has literally cited that aspect of marine law and policy, chapter and verse, by which he has now been empowered by the Marine Corps to talk about his experiences publicly. And I can certainly say that all of the jumpers were that bright, and they also had consummate memories. Look at Brett even quoting things that Ed Dames said in his lectures to us 30 years later. Randy is clearly an extremely intelligent man. For example, during his presentation of his experiences that we started out with, he used the terms psionically, covertly, seditious, and treasonous, which I would dare say, certainly in today's time, is a graduate level of diction. I think it even goes beyond the current undergraduate mastery of English. So he's a brilliant, articulate man, and that was and clearly has a superb memory. And those were three of the human characteristics they were looking for, because they were sending us to another planet, and they wanted us to be able to experience, remember, and articulate what happened to us with as much higher level specificity as possible. When we, for example, would be debriefed by Major Dames at the Mars Jump Room facility in El Segundo, California, he would say, well, what did you see next? What did you see next? And he would thoroughly debrief us about everything that happened, and we were expected to remember everything that happened accurately and articulate it clearly. Another point of correspondence, which is completely random, but again, you see this in the law. When somebody cites a hard fact and it corresponds to another abstruse or abstruse or obtuse or inscrutable fact that another witness is testifying to, that is taken as a touchstone of credibility, because if you have a random selection of the data, small facts should never really correspond. Was the bank robber wearing a purple sweater or a blue sweater? Okay. In his previous public statements, not today, but in previous comments, Randy has stated that the facilities that he lived in on Mars were small. They could have been sprawling campuses. They could have been a fully fledged military base or something. Because we've had the jump room technology to put materiel onto Mars for 30 years, 34 years at least, probably almost 40, if we start with Michael Relf's account. So Randy and I agree that the facilities that we visited, in the case of Randy that he stayed at for many years, were small facilities. And as a trial lawyer, that kind of piques my attention, because there's no reason why that testimony should agree. I mean, Randy states that he went up there as a 17-year-old and was born in 1970, which means that, if I'm correct, Randy, you went up there in 1987 the first time?
That's correct.
Okay.
I want to say the date would have been November 18th, 1987.
Well, there's your superb memory kicking in again. Okay, so Randy first went in 1987, which is 6 years after the Mars Jump Room whistleblowers, jumpers who've come forward, first went in summer of 81. And so here he is, he's going 6 years later, but he's still talking about small facilities. They could have been medium-sized facilities, as I said, sprawling military bases, whatever, but that corresponds factually with a degree of specificity that I find meaningful. Other things that are consistent is that we were shown in our training what the different forms of about 30 large Martian land-based animals were. Randy gave us more information about their anatomy. And in those 7 years, between when we were trained by Dames in 1980 and Randy first going up there 7 years later in 87 and then spending 17 years there, you would expect that permanent personnel on Mars would learn more about the anatomy of the life forms there. So I actually see the difference of opinion between Randy and I about some of the dominant life forms as corroborating, in the sense that he described, for example, that one of them has two hearts. I would hope in 7 years of sending personnel there that our government, working with brilliant people like Randy and Regina Dugan, who entered Caltech at age 16, and a young man who grew up in Hawaii, being raised by a single mom, who would go on to Harvard Law School and Columbia University, who became president, people of that intellectual caliber, would have learned something about the life forms. And in fact, Randy corroborates that they found that one of the life forms has two hearts. I also find something, again, this is one of those factually specific things that cannot be faked. I stated the ages of the jumpers that I knew of for a reason, describing Brett as starting at age, well, when we were going to Mars, he was 14, Regina was 17, I was 18, William McCool was 18, and Barack Obama was 19. Now, if you take the median ages, it's very close to 17. And that's the age that his experiences began, that Randy stated, at least the actual experience of going to Mars. Here you have literally a correspondence between the two groups of experiencers, where both independently state that they first went at age 17. That is complete corroboration of who they were working with. And as testimony, it's weak in the sense that it requires the listener to assume that we were sent at very young ages. I'm often asked, why did they time travel you starting when you were age 6? Why did you all go when you were in your late teens? Why didn't they use astronauts? I mean, wasn't Neil Armstrong 39 when he first set foot on the moon? Well, that's our testimony, and it's difficult testimony. It goes against common logic or common sense, and it corresponds between Randy and the previous whistleblowers, at least, and their colleagues in the jump room program. So I find that a major correspondence that I think is factually significant and affirms Randy's account. Other things that are, also the mode of transport. I stated that it was a teleportation technology called a jump room. Randy has, and as affirmed by Brett and Bernie, and Randy has stated that it was a space plane with teleportation capability. Well, again, we're not agreeing with each other, but we're agreeing that teleportation was used. Now, why would they have, is there an internal logic here to these modes of transport that we've cited, respectively? Yes, there is. We were sent as a group of civilians to achieve those three functions of establishing a defense regime, creating a basis to claim Mars as U.S. territory under public international law, and to acclimate Martian humanoids and animals to our presence. That was not Randy's role. He was a military officer being sent there. And so it makes sense that because military personnel would have to be more mobile on the surface, that we would have been sent basically in a safer way, the jump rooms, so we would be intact when we arrived on Mars. But Randy and his military cadre would need a form of teleportation where they could move in a rapid response way around the surface. So we're both citing teleportation, but Randy's adding the military context of how he got there, which I think is corroborative of the veracity of his claims, the accuracy. A couple things that are more difficult to interpret. One is that the life forms that I encountered were the three, at different times in my life, once on Earth and then twice on Mars, were the humanoids that Alfred described, and the reptoids that I encountered were reptile or dinosaur-like, where I think Randy's talking about more exotic animal life, where you're dealing with either humanoid reptiles or insectivoid mammals. And so an explanation for that is present in the account of both of us, and also with Brett and Bernie's affirmation, which is that clearly we were visiting the middle latitudes, and Randy stated in his testimony here today that he was clearly in a northern latitude. He was in a polar location, which is, well, I shouldn't say northern. It was a polar location, either in the northern or southern reaches of Mars, where we know there is snow, which he testified to. So the fact that it was always about 70 degrees when I got there, and that Randy was talking about the cold that he was courageously dealing with for those 17 years, that is attributable to latitude. And we don't know why they were putting a U.S. presence there. It may literally have been to protect the primarily medium latitude humanoid civilization from the more aggressive exotic creatures that were in the northern latitudes. And I might add that the striding gremlin that I found in January of 2010, in that famous photograph of the so-called Martian trees, it is a reptoid or frog-like looking bipedal creature with about a 6-foot tall human in its clutches. That could indicate predation. We know that was a northern or polar area of Mars because we know where that photograph was taken. It was taken very close to the North Pole of Mars. And so that corresponds, that anomaly finding made by myself on behalf of the Mars Anomaly Research Society corresponds to Randy's claims that he encountered reptoids and exotic insectivoid mammal-type creatures in his location in a polar region of Mars, in several mutually or simultaneously corresponding ways. So I think the striding gremlin photograph corroborates at least three major factual elements of the account of Randy Kramer. Another sticking point for me initially, and why I was skeptical and I should have been less prejudiced, so I apologize, Randy, is temperature. But then again, we were in different locations on the planet. The other one, which was strongest in my mind in disbelieving you, and I now see no problem with it, is the color of the sky. As I testified before, images of it were found by Mars anomalists like Paul Goodwin and of the United Kingdom and Andrew R. Steck of the United States. I had already stated publicly, I believe I stated, Alfred, in our first public appearance about the Mars cover-up at James Gilliland's sanctuary, his annual summer conference in Trout Lake, Washington. I stated that the Martian sky was blue, and that was one of the things that was later going to be corroborated by Anomalous. Well, I had a sticking point in the sense that Randy had given testimony that the sky was red, but it was at his location. And it was at a location where there could be red dust kicked up in the atmosphere, and there was clearly snow. And if you look at the mountain scene from that polar location, in which we found the putative trees, and then I identified the striding gremlin, which is basically my favorite discovery because it's such an exotic creature. It's so neat, as an animal. At that location, it's much more likely that the sky would be red because of snow, and the hillsides there are kind of a chartreuse, kind of a dark red, which I think Randy described in his interview to Dr. Michael Salla. So I would just like to say, to make a long story short, one other element. Randy has stated a rank as captain in the U.S. Marine Corps, and I clearly can tell by his high intelligence and his great articulateness that he's clearly the caliber of individual that the branches of the military service have always assigned military rank to, namely accelerated into the officer corps, going all the way back to the Revolutionary War. But also, the rank of captain is the same status within the Marine Corps that the rank of lieutenant commander is in the Navy. And two individuals who have served the U.S. intelligence community military in need-to-know capacities, namely the CIA officer Courtney Maurice Hunt and somebody who was once the top civilian scientist for the Navy, Dr. Eldon Andrew Bird, both told me that they had verified that as a result of my service in Project Pegasus and then the Mars Project, I'm covertly or shadow listed in U.S. Navy records as a lieutenant commander, and I was accelerated to that position when I earned my Juris Doctor degree, which is a doctoral degree. I've never verified that, but I have testimony from two sources that is the case, and that is the corresponding rank in the Navy. Randy had no way of knowing that because I had never stated that publicly, because I was concerned that I would be identified as a whistleblower who was playing some covert role for the Navy, but I'm not. I'm an independent whistleblower, and I'm not doing any functions for the Navy, and besides these two programs, I never have. But I did have my picture taken as a Navy officer in fall of '81. So just to sum this all up, even the things like the time frame, how Randy started 3 years after we had ended creating a context for military presence there. The bottom line is that I am utterly convinced of the veracity of these two individuals and the truth of their account, and the fact that something very important is happening right now in the truth movement, which is that individuals with fundamentally important information about the U.S. presence on Mars and the fact that it is an inhabited planet and all of the implications and complications that obtain is now happening in real time. We have entered the era of truth. And it's an honor to serve with both of you in that important cause in human civilization.
Thank you, Andrew. I really appreciate that. It has meant a lot to me to hear that, and I've always had questions about which things make sense to me or that I experienced that other people may or may not have experienced, and I feel that I've tried to get good information on geographical locations that would account for different ecosystems and different biological habitats and so forth. So I appreciate all of that. Thank you very much. And I just want to specify, I'm pretty sure when I did my interview with Michael Salla that I tried to make it clear that the sky could be a lot of different colors, from blue to red to purple. And so, yeah, I mean, I definitely have a very clear memory of the mountainside that we pretty much lived in, on a very regular basis, having a very, very bright, clear blue sky on a regular basis. But very interesting times, sunrise, sunsets, where you could get this really, really lavender purple sky, which is quite amazing.
Right, and this goes to the principle in the law that absence of evidence does not connote evidence of absence. Because right. I only went to the warm equatorial region of Mars. Your experience includes either both or being at more polar latitudes where there was snow and so forth. And so you did clarify essentially the color schema from the equator up to the poles, the north and south pole of Mars, quite credibly, because there's different atmospheric factors that would attribute the purple. the fact that I didn't encounter the purple doesn't mean that your account of encountering purple skies is not true.
Oh, right.
It could very well be attributable to what seems present in the facts, which is that you were in a different region of the planet.
Yeah, for certain. And I would get the impression that some of the larger, predatory reptiles that would have been more active in a warmer southern region would not necessarily have liked being on the surface in the cold. Because pretty much everybody up in that region was living underground where it was warmer near, sort of geothermal activity or something.
Yeah. And also, there's also something that we can speculate about. I don't really find evidence of it when I compare our accounts.
Right.
But I think it's entirely possible that the animals that you report, the two major animals that you testified to in your interview with Dr. Sala, and to some extent here today, Alfred referenced it, the sort of bipedal reptoid humanoid and the insectivoid, apparently mammalian type, possibly bipedal creature as well, that those might have been the life forms that we were being put in the equatorial region to help protect the humanoids I've described, namely our genetic cousins on Mars, Homo martis terris, the classic Martian humanoid with the elongated head and sometimes antennae in the forehead and pointy ears and long fingers, the Homo martis martis, and then even possibly the Homo martis extraterrestrialis, which are like the gray ETs, that we may have been there in the equatorial region and unopposed by those three types of humanoids, because up in the more polar regions, there were two species of advanced intelligent predators. We were dealing with predators that were basically stupid dinosaurs.
Right.
But you're describing two species of bipedal, advanced intelligent predators that seemed very, very threatening and a high risk to you and your colleagues. And we were at risk of predation by the dinosaur-like reptoids, but they were a pretty animal-like intelligence. And so
yeah,
I
they're
think that
very, very intelligent for certain. I mean, certainly our first interactions with them, we engaged in a little bit of prejudice of not thinking they were intelligent, but believe me, over time it became very, very, very clear that they were equal or in some cases, superior intelligence to our average or above average.
So in that way, I think your testimony corroborates that of Brett and Bernie and I, in the sense that gives the raison d'etre for why the indigenous humanoid civilization in the warm regions, which was presumably equatorial, didn't ever oppose our presence. We were never confronted. Courtney Hunt and I were even met at the front of one of the jump rooms by one of the indigenous Martians, the Homo martis martis, and walked about a mile with him taking huge strides. And he took us down into one small area of their underground civilization. And that also, by the way, is corroborative of not only what I experienced on Mars, being taken down into that primarily underground civilization by that being, but by the testimony of CIA officer Virginia Olds, who contacted me 4 days after I published my paper, The Discovery of Life on Mars, in 2008-2009 timeframe. And she testified that my paper was accurate and that I needed to know that there were about 1 million humanoids living in a primarily underground civilization there, because she didn't have the information about me going there. She was just affirming the humanoids that I had placed in the paper, and that there were about 1 million and that they lived underground. So you didn't know that testimony. Alfred and I did, so Alfred and I can, Alfred can corroborate my claim that Virginia Olds gave that testimony in 2008 and 9, and now in your testimony you're affirming the concept, the fact that there's an extensive underground civilization there.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I'm just honored.
The
to appear in
surface
the same
is
show as you.
hostile enough seasonally that there's really no way that you could have an above-ground colony or civilization that wasn't heavily shielded or protected. And I wouldn't even recommend that from, just the seasonal storms that can get, 100 miles an hour plus.
Right, especially with the loss of their ionosphere during the solar system catastrophe of 11,500 BCE. Lightly complected humanoids would have to seek shelter from the sun to not develop skin cancer and other maladies. So,
we had a very protective environment suit, very, covering every inch of you, and a pretty solid helmet with a pretty good cover. It was very protective. You were sealed in and covered tight for sure.
And the humanoids that I showed over in the rock garden north of Tsiolkovsky Ridge in NASA JPA image PIA 10214 are wearing something in the nature of a royal blue neoprene wetsuit-like garment.
Huh, that's the light armor. Huh, that. Wow. Okay, that's a confirmation I've never shared with anybody, is what the light armor looks like. And the light armor looks more like a bluish neoprene, tighter, kind of like a thick wetsuit, but not. Yeah, that's the light body armor, not the heavy powered. Ah.
Right, they're a little lighter than royal blue. Very pretty shade of blue. And also, we didn't need to do that. We weren't even screened for contamination by bacteria and virus when we returned to El Segundo, because we were told we were there for such short periods of time that if we got a little extra solar radiation, it wasn't going to give us skin cancer.
Right.
So we were wearing street clothes. I did about 30 trips to the telecommunications post, which was about a mile from the jump room that we would call the Corkscrew, and I was just in my clothing from college. In fact, one of my classmates asked me about the red dust on my boots when I went back to UCLA and walked to class. And so I was literally taking the dust of Mars to Chatsworth, to Westwood, when I was living my ordinary life after returning through the El Segundo jump room. And so, yeah, we were just dressed in street clothes.
Wow. Yeah. Well, when I first got there and we got off the lander that brought us there, we were basically, I'm sure we were at a lower, more mid-region, like maybe what you're talking about, where Ares Primus was, because we stepped out into the open air and it was a cool breeze, but I could feel warm sun hitting me, and we were just wearing, like these coverall jumpsuits with really nothing else on, and we're, walked across the tarmac from there to a smaller shuttle that took us to our more permanent locations. But when we first got there, yeah, it was just, step on out into the air and then just coveralls.
Right. Now, another thing, just to close out, one thing that is sort of a corollary to one of the findings where I find correlation is that lieutenant commander in the U.S. Navy and the lieutenant and the captain rank in the Army and Marine Corps are the first qualifying intelligence ranks. That is, to literally have top secret intelligence communicated, remembered, to take executive action to protect it, to even take human life to protect highly classified information. And Randy and I both state that rank. Civilians would not know that. I mean, I'm obviously a civilian in the sense now that I'm no longer employed on these projects. But within the culture of intelligence, that is a known fact. And so I would just like to share that on this broadcast, that these programs are so highly classified that anybody claiming participation and knowledge of project details would have to have reached that rank. Of course, Brett mentions that when we did our first jump, we were informed that we had reached the lieutenant rank in the U.S. Navy, and so the individuals who even were serving basically in a quasi-military capacity, if not a civilian capacity, we still were shadow listed as military officers, and those are the first qualifying intelligence ranks, and that's another similarity that my account and Randy's have that I think is corroborating.
This is really excellent. I can't even tell you, having spoken to both of you separately and heard the stories and everything, this interaction between the two of you is really, really fascinating. Let's bring Laura and Alfred in and take this last 20 minutes or so and just allow sort of a free flow of thoughts and interaction between the four of you about this and different things that have come up while each of you were speaking.
Sure. Yeah, what came up for me, the first question, which I'd like to ask both Randy and Andy, is this: why do you think there is such secrecy about Earth's visits to Mars among Earth society? Why keep this secret? I don't get it.
I'd be happy to answer that question from my intelligence briefings that I get on a weekly basis now from my brigadier general. We've had conversations about that, and the agenda has been Well, okay, the agenda started as a preservation program in which we wanted to preserve the DNA and the culture and so forth of human society. Over time, that became co-opted to a program. Hey, why don't we just keep what we like and get rid of everybody else? And so over time, the secrecy has been maintained because the program has changed from one of, hey, let's just save everything, to, nah, let's save a few people and then get rid of everybody else we don't want. So the reason for maintaining secrecy over time, it was not because it was supposed to be that way, but because the agenda has shifted to one of, let's save the very special people that we want to keep at the Mars colony and on the lunar colony and the lunar base, and then maybe just get rid of everybody else on Earth, what we call the surface dwellers.
Huh.
Alfred, I would add that my theory, obviously I was involved in the program earlier than Randy, so my statement can, I think, be considered less authoritative, because I agree that it should not have been kept secret, but I think it was an intelligence, a form of an intelligence finding, that because the success of the project involved zero infinity risk, namely it would be successfully implemented or it would be a catastrophe, that they decided to keep it secret because they would be doing things like maintaining a military operation and presence on another planet, and they wanted to make sure that happened. I mean, in the same way they wanted to ultimately acquire Mars, namely conquer it under public international law by sending settlers and regular visitors there, I think they wanted to make sure that the defense regime was implemented, because it may have implicated, if Earth is destroyed, it may implicate literally the survival of the human genome. And that was of such singular significance to the human race that they wanted to make sure that they didn't involve the democratic processes and public and institutions of our civilization in the process of maintaining the presence there. For example, if it was a $1 trillion expenditure, they would have had to do things like have Donald Rumsfeld announce that $2.3 trillion were missing from the defense budget on 9/10 of 2001, and then the next day launch the false flag of 9/11. So, when you're dealing with a $1 trillion project with a small group of civilian and military personnel, but one that nonetheless is related to the survival of the human race in the cosmos, I think recognizing that fact, they decided to not hazard the civilian factors, which could have included things like defunding the program.
Well,
Absolutely. I think that's absolutely correct, and I'm certain that the original thinking around that was absolutely correct. I'm just interjecting that over time it became more of we're a big bunch of fat cats, and why don't we just keep this for ourselves and screw everybody else? So I think initially the intentions were sound and scientific and logical and good, and it's just become kind of psychologically perverted for a number of reasons.
Okay, well, here's my question then. So we're dealing with, different timelines, and some of these potential catastrophes that they might have wanted to save the human genome in regards to seem to be based on HAARP or artificial events that were basically put in motion through, these technologies. So how can we tell, what's real and what isn't, and what are we going to do here now that we've got FEMA camps breathing down our neck and Ebola viruses, and now that you're able to disclose, Randy, and this is for you too, Andrew, where do you see us going with these threats, and where does that relate to timelines and the timelines that they want to see? Because it seems like there's a few. One would be, the simulated catastrophes. Another one might be something more natural, and then the ones that they're engineering, Ebola, and then FEMA camps. Just help us to sort all this out if you could.
Sure,
even though that's a complicated question, but just how to get a grip on where we are right now and what these timelines are and who's in charge here.
Right. No, I'm happy to do that because this is certainly a subject of regular intelligence conversations that I'm having with the Brigadier General. So this is right up the alley of things that we've been talking about. So you have essentially, if you want to look at the tiny number of people who are in power around the world who occupy positions of authority and power, it's a tiny percentage of people. However you want to look at them and see them, that coalition of personnel is divided up into a number of factions, little sub-factions, who essentially make up 2 or 3 larger maxi factions at the moment. And the problem with what's happening with the maxi factions is you have a side in which says, in order to create our perfect new civilization using all this wonderful technology and everything we have, first thing we have to do is clean out this crappy old civilization by burning it, flushing it, whatever, to get rid of the things that we don't want in order to rebuild this much better civilization that we think, that we have the technology for. But essentially they don't want to spend the money and the time to make that transition from where we are to that. They would rather just get rid of what they don't like and then implement something. The opposing maxi factions to that are saying either A or B, which is, we really think that that's a serious negative impact that we're not going to easily psychologically or emotionally recover from it as a people or as a species, having that large of a die-off or a cull-off on the entire planet in order to rebuild without, going the next century trying to recover from, collective post-traumatic stress disorder that would set us back, maybe a bit. Versus this other sort of maxi faction that said, no, bad idea. The second that we destabilize ourselves and weaken our infrastructure and weaken the population and weaken our ability to defend ourselves is the second that any of these actual threatening invasion plans that may be on somebody's books who are, waiting in the wings for us to look moment and to look like we've got a wounded leg and then come in for the kill. So a number of intelligence reports, the intelligence officers of the United States Marine Corps Special Section and some other intelligence agencies around the world are certainly seeing this action of driving it into the ground in order to rebuild it as a negative setup, in which will lead us to a situation in which we will be made vulnerable and could be attacked. So given that scenario, here's what I think is about to happen or is happening. That's all fighting itself out. Those people are completely fighting and attacking and destroying each other in a huge way that we see some aspects of it manifesting itself in sort of the non-covert world, but we also don't see a lot of it. But we're going to see more and more and more and more of it. So I will say that in one way it's going to get worse before it gets better. But on the other hand, that some of what we're seeing is the manifestation of some very, very negative people in control for a very, very long time are losing their grip. And I think we can predict that they are about to lose their grip that is giving them that kind of unchecked control. And that control is going to be checked really, really soon, which is going to put everything in question, which will give us the opportunity for, again, that coalitions of those micro and maxi factions of the people who try and run the world to renegotiate a whole new plan and agenda for the planet that could look way better than the alternative 3 Agenda 21 that's on the table now, and would give us an opportunity to, instead of cleaning out 6 or 7 billion people, actually shoring up civilization and creating a floor for the entire planet, and then implementing a futuristic technological economy market plan that actually transitions us from this old 18th century 19th century coal burning, fossil fuel burning, wage slave system into something that's actually a 21st century model. Which, one last thing I want to interject in that statement is, I think one of the main reasons that they have been fighting disclosure of all these extraterrestrial species that could be talking to us is because if we started talking to our neighbors, we would find that very few of them have these exploitative, consumption, market-based models, and we would realize that that's not a really good way of doing things, and we would have other models to start looking at on how we can actually easily transition ourselves by looking at other models that have done that. One of the reasons we sit there and go, what do we do, is because we're not looking at other models of success. And the second that we get to talk to our intergalactic brothers and sisters and our neighbors, they will be happy to sit down and show us their models of success that they've worked over the last number of hundreds of thousands of years for themselves.
Right.
So that's where I think we are, and that's where I think we're headed.
Yeah, that is very interesting. What occurs to me with regard to Mars is that there are, very credible reports that the Martians had a regular Earth education program going in the first part of the 20th century, whereby they would regularly have delegations of leading Earth opinion makers taken on 2-week jaunts of Mars. They would pick them up either in Brazil, I think was one of the main launch points, and they would be taken probably to the Homo Martis Terris, that is to the advanced human civilization on Mars. I think that the Vatican was one of the main arrangers of this, and it was out of the Vatican actually that the chronovisor technology came, and so we have this track here where there was a lot of quote an enlightened intercultural exchange program going on that even preceded any of the U.S. military programs. And so I'm just wondering whether or not the U.S. elites were influenced by Illuminati factions who are influenced by negative interdimensional and ET factions to sort of push aside these positive cultural communication factions with Mars and get more into a Martial presence on Mars, which then led into the alternative 3. Either, i.e., the alternative 3 didn't come out of nowhere. There was always, and even if you go back to Tesla and the interactive program that he started in 1901 with the flash from Mars, and then with his thing back and forth, there was a period of enlightened cultural communication between Earth and Mars at that time, which then the Martians grew into cultural visits with leading, Earth humans, smart people of a positive nature, which I think then was taken over by the negative elites, which led to the U.S. kind of invasion or military type. Could you comment on that, both of you?
I think that could very well describe the development of this current situation. The only thing I would add is, in terms of the eras involved and the fact that not just around the turn of the last century when Tesla was communicating with the Martians, but even as recently as 1970 when my father and I had contact with 3 Martian astronauts at a hangar in New Jersey, an air hangar in New Jersey, and they were clearly on a technical liaison mission in which they were assisting the United States government to develop conventional spacecraft or aircraft as advanced as theirs, namely what in all likelihood became Project Aurora, that they were basically humane, cooperative individuals who were briefing our aerospace community. So I guess that we could ultimately be in a common defense regime with them. So some element of this involves protecting both planets, probably, and that also explains why the Martian humanoids posed no opposition to us when we were roaming around their planet. So I think an element in this may be a multi-generational plan for Earthians and Martians to collaborate to protect the civilizations of both planets from an off-planet threat, or also to assist the Martian population in circumstances that are much more difficult to cope with because of the biological limits of Mars versus Earth. That we may have made a deal where, for example, they gave us the jump rooms and the Martian space planes, namely the Aurora, in exchange for us sending civilian and military personnel there to protect the sort of equatorial, benign human or benevolent humanoid civilization from bipedal humanoids living elsewhere on the planet that represented a pretty serious threat to individual Martians and perhaps to their civilization. And then you have the factor of potentially off-planet threats. There's also the fact that there would have been an interest on the part of both, as we can see in Graham Hancock's book, The Mars Mystery, to protect both Earth and Mars from a return of the catastrophe where they were struck by debris from space. Graham Hancock makes the argument that that debris field may have been circling and it may come back to hit both planets again in the nature of a meteor shower, cycling back across the skies of a given planet. So there may be sound cooperative reasons why there would have been this multi-generational covert program. Of course, our friend Jay Weidner claims that the Bavarian Illuminati, or that is to say, his definition of the Bavarian Illuminati would be the York Rite of Freemasonry that was started by Adam Weishaupt beginning in 1776, was for the purpose of creating the United States of America so that ultimately it could arrange the return of human beings to Mars. And that being an explanation of why the dollar bill has the Great Pyramid on it, because the Great Pyramid was sort of the marker or shrine on Earth where the Earth linkage of the last civilization was symbolized. So I don't know if the conspiracy goes that far back. Certainly maybe socially and politically it does. But I think the immediate conspiracy could have been launched entirely for beneficial reasons. Maybe Ed Dames was telling us the truth when he gave us the three major reasons. But in response to something that Lauren said, I'd like to say that, in fact, we don't know whether we were told the truth. Maybe the whole reason for getting personnel up there was because there are certain strategic minerals on Mars that they needed to launch Star Wars, to implement the Star Wars defense regime or something more Earth-based. But I think that it's a good thing that Earthians and Martians have been in communication and that we've been there. But at the same time, I also agree with Randy's observation that it was clearly a program that was corrupted. So I think we're clearly having a hygienic effect in talking about it. You know, Justice Brandeis stated that Justice Louis D. Brandeis stated that sunshine is the ultimate antiseptic, and so I would add that truth is the ultimate antidote to unconstitutionality. So just to close out by saying, in response to Laura's major question, I think the major response should be a truth presidency that would establish processes of truth-telling around the ET cover-up, the time travel cover-up, the Mars cover-up, and all of the genocidal-related programs like FEMA, chemtrails, HAARP, and Ebola in open congressional testimony under a truth president and vice president, possibly to include Andrew DiBasciago and Laura M. Eisenhower. That would be my main response. We need a truth presidency. It's not true that the president is at some low position in the intelligence community. The president has to be consulted and has to agree on the launching of all of these covert intelligence and military programs. They're under his constitutional responsibility. We are clearly dealing with the advent of unconstitutional forms of government, and I think that the major antidote has to be a truth presidency.
All right.
Well,
I just want to step in here, just looking at the time, and that was perfect, Andrew, because I'm going to ask each person to do their closing remark, and so we've got you covered. Randy, let's go to you, and then Laura, and then to Alfred, and let's just tie up your, we've got about a minute and a half each, so just a few sentences that ties up your energy around all this and the value of this and perhaps even what's next.
Certainly, I'll be happy to. I think I have a pretty specific message that I can end here with. United States Marine Corps Special Section Special Code Article 21 stipulates that Special Section officers, under the conditions under which either a 50% reduction in 50% reduction in invasive or compromised leadership, which would mean that if if more than 49% of what we can identify as the governmental structure were to be compromised, and or a situation under which 75% or greater hampering of efficiency of that operational governmental device has been reduced by a percentage of 75% or more, allows special section officers to disregard other agreements, other secrecy oaths, other contracts, other treaties, in order to restore legislative and executive constitutionality and legal authority over programs which have gone rogue and out of authority, which are clearly what's responsible for every ill that we can think of is really caused by some secret organization doing something that they have twisted and warped into something that's very negative. I will absolutely agree that many of these things were started with the best of intentions, and a lot of fear and paranoia was infused because of what was happening during and after World War II, and it got everyone very scared and frightened of a global militarized dominating force of any kind, and made everyone think that they had to be defensive about that. But we are at a state now where we have gotten so far from the legal, executive, constitutional, legislative authority that I want to make it very clear to every single politically elected person to office, every legislative person in the executive branch, every single military officer who is within the sound of my voice needs to understand that irregardless of any other orders which they have been given, those orders are illegal and do not apply when restoration of legal, constitutional, legislative, and executive authority is the priority in the umbrella of law. If I'm to understand this, and I'm not a lawyer, in the umbrella of law, those articles of the Constitution are greater than everything else. And so everyone needs to understand that whatever papers you sign, whatever anybody has told you you must do or you must not do, you need to understand that is not true. You have one obligation that you have sworn your oaths to, and one obligation only, and that is to protect the people, country, planet, and the people, Constitution of... I'm flustered. The people, country, Constitution of the United States of America from all enemies, foreign and domestic. And so any domestic enemy which has reduced legality to rogue illegality and criminality is criminal and is not within the law and does not have legal authority. And I want to remind every person of that none of those persons who are exerting illegal control, they do not have legal authority whatsoever. Persons who are acting within the appropriate codes of their the UCMJ and or the specific codes and regulations of their military branch and their oaths, those people are in proper legal authority and have the authority to arrest those other people. I'm done.
Thank you, Randy. And Laura?
Well, I just want to say we all know that we have incredible power, purpose, potential, and promise. We really need to upgrade and recognize what we're truly made of. And so my term Alternative 4 is really about the power of the human spirit. It's all about the unification of the human race. It's about us being authentic, about us doing the inner work, and about us waking up on the inside as we learn about what's happening on the outside, and that we all step up and take responsibility for our part because we each have that collective purpose.
Excellent. And Alfred?
Yes, I'd like to say that from an historical perspective for which there's good evidence, Earth and Mars were an interplanetary society up until about 11,500 years ago, and we are now in the initial phases of reintegrating Earth and Mars as a reintegrated interplanetary society. And this began with the initiative of the Martians, as far as we can tell, at the turn of the century, when they started to contact our most advanced scientists, namely Tesla, who picked up on it and began his series of communications. The Martians then reached out and started a Visit Mars for 2 weeks on a cultural holiday program. They had tours organized with leading cultural figures from around the world. They would spend 2 weeks on Mars. All of this seems to have been hijacked sometime after World War II with the alternative three, and so where the Earth forces, the kind of the negative forces now, who want to take it over, and who wanted to hide the initial positive Martian overtures toward Earth to reunite us as a society, and those figures, they're going beyond trying to colonize Mars. As Randy indicated, they are trying to depopulate Earth and make Earth kind of an elite theme park, or even blow us up, some kind of odd mind control dream from their negative interdimensional handlers. So this is so sci-fi, irregular that I urge everyone to really wake up to the larger picture. Have U.S. constitutions in hand. Listen to the man Randy. Listen to Andy, to people who have been on Mars. Look at the historical record, and move forward. And I want to thank you all. Thank you.
Wow, this has really been incredible. I'd like to just say to Randy Kramer and Andrew Basiago and Laura Eisenhower and Alfred Weber, thank you so much for your dedication and commitment. It's not always easy, and I know that from firsthand seeing it. But you all are making a huge difference, and you're making that difference on behalf of all of us. And I honor you and more respect than I could ever put into words for each of you. And thank you so much for bringing this to Awaken the Dream Radio this evening.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Good night.
Thank you.
Awake in the Dream Radio with Laura Eisenhower and Dr. Dream.